Hello and welcome to Politics Today. I'm Farooq Pitafi. Viewers, while most of us were watching William Shatner going to the space and coming back, during that time, everybody in Afghanistan must be still going through hell because the economic situation at this moment, it seems, is near collapse. Inflation has gone up, and up. And while it is happening, Afghan Taliban don't seem to be ready to reform. On the other side, when you talk to the international community, you see they want to help Afghan people, but the Afghan de facto government seems to be a big roadblock. So today, once again, we are going to talk about this matter because Afghanistan needs urgent bailout or support. We saw that during the G20 summit, we also saw statements that were made, pledges made to avert a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. But while these commitments are being made, what exactly is it that can be done? We know that the Afghani or the Afghan currency, that is Afghani, is really struggling at this moment. It is 20% down, but that too is a miracle because on the other side you see that Afghan government or the Taliban don't have access to most of the foreign currency reserves. On the other side, winter is coming, and if anybody among you has gone to Afghanistan, you would know that winters there are pretty harsh. COVID still is a factor. Poverty, hunger, all these matters are huge concerns. We are going to talk about the ways to engage with Afghanistan, whether, regardless whether the world can engage with the Taliban or not. We are going to do that, and I'm going to introduce the panelists as well in a bit. Before that, there's a package that our team has prepared for you. Let us watch that.
Now that the war in Afghanistan is over and Taliban are in power, the country faces yet another challenge, but at the economic front. Although Taliban are facing multiple challenges at governing Afghanistan, international recognition and looming economic crisis seem to be at the top of the list. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres on Monday warned that this was a make or break moment for Afghanistan. He called on the world to inject liquidity into the Afghan economy to prevent its collapse, while urging the Taliban to uphold their promises to protect the rights of all Afghans. After the United Nations urged world leaders to put billions of dollars into the Afghan economy, the members of the G20 group of the major economies in a virtual summit have pledged to avert a major humanitarian and socio-economic collapse in Afghanistan. Pledges also include a promise by the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to give €1 billion to Afghanistan and to neighboring countries taking in the refugees. Chancellor Angela Merkel reaffirmed Germany's pledge of €600 million to avert a socio-economic collapse in Afghanistan. Now, the US President Joe Biden stressed that aid should be provided via independent international organizations and not directly to the ruling Taliban. The Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi said that the G20 countries had to have contact with the Taliban, but that did not mean recognition of the Islamist group's government. Also, Russia is currently waiting for a response from the invited parties, including the Taliban, to hold a Moscow format meeting under the auspices of the United Nations to provide assistance, including humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. According to the World Bank, 43% of Afghanistan's GDP came from foreign aid. About 75% of the public spending was funded by foreign aid grants. 90% of Afghans lived on an income of less than $2 a day, and an estimated 18.4 million people, nearly half the country's population, were in need of humanitarian aid. After the Taliban took power on August 15th, the freezing of assets and international aid by the United States, Germany, Finland, World Bank, European Union, International Monetary Fund was a move intended to halt the flow of money to the Taliban, but the effects have been felt far beyond Taliban leadership.
Bear in mind that when Afghan Taliban took over Kabul, at that time it was thought that perhaps the Western governments are not going to recognize Afghan Taliban as a government, but the Eastern powers like China, like Russia, like Turkey will probably acknowledge them and recognize them. But that hasn't happened either. In fact, while the Russian government has said that there should be a UN summit on the matter, President Erdogan of Turkey has said that there should be help from all over the world to make sure that the Taliban form a government which is inclusive. So it seems that there are many caveats, and we are going to talk about that as well. And the focus has to be relief for Afghanistan. In order to help us understand these issues, in the studio I'm joined by Dr. Niaz Mutsa, who is a political economist and also a columnist of renown. Thank you very much, sir, for being part of the program. Professor Scott Lucas joins us from UK, and he is an expert on political matters in Afghanistan and development, international politics as well. Thank you very much, Professor Lucas, for being part of the program. My third guest is Brigadier Retired Saad Mohammed, who is a senior analyst, has served in Kabul as well with the embassy there. And he is going to help us understand the local crisis topography. Thank you very much, Brigadier Sir, for being part of the program. With your permission, sirs, let me start with the studio. Dr. Niaz Mutsa, in coming days, winter is coming, literally, and economic situation is not getting better at all. So what happens now and how the world can help Afghanistan?
Well, and let's remember, you gave a long list of, problems that Afghanistan is facing. But, there is one problem that it is not facing, which was expected, which was that, a continuation of war. Yeah. There was this expectation that, the Afghan army would, stand up and be able to, at least put up some fight. That hasn't happened. Then, there was a fear that, the opposition groups, militias, Northern Alliance or whatever you call them, they might, continue the fight. That hasn't happened.
Yeah, so, but the worst might be happening right now.
But then, there are so many other issues, one after another. So I think the biggest issue has been, the behavior of the Afghan Taliban. There was some hope that, after being in the wilderness for 20 years and, having gone through some sort of a change, metamorphosis, especially, the face that you saw in Doha, the more moderate faction, when they'll come into power, they will show more sense. And that was also Pakistan's hope, maybe fond hope, but what has turned out is that they are as bad as they were previously. Right. And what is worse is there seems to be a huge tension and conflict going on between them. Right. And you might ask them to make a change, and there might be one faction within the Afghan Taliban which may be ready for that, Mullah Baradar and some of those other people. Yeah. But then it's also very clear that there's a much stronger, much more well-armed section of Afghan Taliban which are not willing. One,
right?
Yeah.
And Mullah Baradar doesn't seem to be that big a factor right now.
Right
I don't know
now,
whether it is.
Yeah, I mean, he was the face.
Yeah.
Okay.
With your permission, let me go to Professor Lucas. Sir, your take on Afghanistan situation and how to improve it.
Well, I think the immediate situation is that of some aid which can go into Afghanistan, where, as you mentioned, 14 million people are food deprived, many without adequate electricity, many without adequate water facing the winter. You can get aid to Afghanistan by going through NGOs, going through the United Nations, if the Taliban does not block it. And it was very significant yesterday that the G20 made a specific commitment to do this, and that the European Union said, in particular, we will pledge 1 billion euros. That's an increase of 50% on what they were planning for emergency humanitarian assistance. So I think very soon, within weeks, we're going to have a test. Will the Taliban allow the UN and NGOs to run aid into the country without putting it through Taliban agencies? Now, there's a wider challenge beyond that, of course, and that is for a functioning national economy, you need development aid, you need economic assistance, you would need some of those Afghan assets to be unfrozen, but no country right now is saying that they want to do that through a Taliban which hasn't even formed an effective government. And I think it was very interesting that you noted at the start that we knew that the US and Europe were going to put conditions on any development aid, respect for human rights, suitable governance. We thought Eastern countries including Pakistan, might not put the conditions on that assistance, but so far they've been very cautious. They've held back. So I think we have two features here. The immediate humanitarian crisis, where there will be some action, but the longer-term issue of Afghan economic stability, that's going to be something that there is no immediate solution. That will be a problem for some time.
Right. Professor Lucas, economic problem seems to be big as well and contributing to humanitarian element. And that is because Afghanistan doesn't even print its own currency. It had to be printed in Poland, but because most of the world governments don't recognize Taliban, that operation is halted as well. Do you think that in coming days there is some kind of middle ground where even if you don't recognize Afghan Taliban, there is some informal kind of relationship? Because at this moment, when you talk about NGOs, they might be trying to do a lot, but it won't be easy in Afghanistan ruled by Afghan Taliban.
Well, there are two issues here, and the first you've just identified. In some respects, this commitment by the international community to provide humanitarian aid through NGOs is a test of the Taliban. And that is, will the Taliban agree to let this assistance come into the country? Will they allow the NGOs and the UN to operate? If the Taliban interfere with that, that's almost a deal breaker for further discussions. Now, the wider issue which you raise, which is the Afghan financial and banking system, that's going to have to come when the Taliban can show they have effective working agencies, which not only protect human rights, which I do think is a concern for the West, but can actually run the national government efficiently. And your studio guest identified the problem with that. We do not have a single Taliban. We have the Baradar group, which was operating in Doha in Qatar, which was the main point of contact for many Western governments. And we have the Kandahar group, which has filled most of the ministries and which has not really shown a sign that it wants to engage with the West, not just the West, the international community on those vital economic questions without the Taliban having full control of the terms of the negotiations.
Right, that is a point well made, and that actually shows the contradictions on ground. Brigadier Saad, sir, your take on Afghanistan. The impression was that at least there will be some recognition of Afghan Taliban as a government by countries like Russia that still are dealing with them and working with them. But we haven't seen that kind of a breakthrough. Why would that be?
You know, the principal reason is that there are multiple extremist groups which are still present in Afghanistan, and they include the TTP. So there's with Pakistan. There is the ATM, which creates friction with China. Tajikistan, which is Russia-backed, and you have the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. Both, ex-Soviet republics, and both dependent on Russia for their security. Now, if their security is threatened, which at this point appears so, or Tajikistan at least says so, that they have problems with Afghanistan. So Russia, Pakistan, China, and Iran also to some extent, because Iran also looks at the Shia community and as well the Farsi-speaking community in Afghanistan as their natural allies. So there would be an immediate recognition by at least these countries, which apparently look to be pro-Taliban, and some people were, guessing that there could be some recognition if these countries get together and they form a group which recognizes the Taliban and then ultimately paves the way for the other countries and the international community to recognize the Taliban regime. The Taliban at this point in time, every such resistance movement has 2 or 3 streams within them. The hardliners, the middle roaders, and you have the soft ones or the doves. Now, the soft case, which was present in Doha, led by Mullah Baradar, there was a tussle, there was a power tussle within the Taliban, which around one goes to the hardliners. And if you look at them, half of them are what they were in 1996 to 2001. Now, that is bad news and that is disappointing. Taliban, at the humanitarian crisis which is coming up in Afghanistan, the economic meltdown has come in Afghanistan. So making concessions, what is the international demanding? The communities become expensive. And to inclusive means politically inclusive, not that a few Talib, non-Pashtuns and they put them in the government. They would like, political groups to become part of the regime. What is the constitution? What are they ruling?
Right.
What is the legitimacy?
Right. Before we move forward, Brigadier Sahab, you have studied Afghanistan, you have worked in Afghanistan. Let me ask you, how likely it is that the moderate Taliban, who kept on promising human rights, made assurances about human rights and women's rights as well, that they are going to prevail and there is going to be some leeway for Afghan women and girls, because we know even now they haven't been allowed to go to schools.
I would, before I make an attempt to make an assessment on that, what you have asked, what Lord Curzon, and Lord Curzon, who was a viceroy of British India, had once remarked, anybody who claims to understand the Afghan mind should have his own head examined. So to predict the Afghan mind, he was unpredictable in his behavior. And at times he wouldn't even care. He would listen to you and you think he has agreed with you, but he will go and do something completely opposite. But besides the point, what should they do at this point in time? What is the international community asking them? Girls' education? And the heavens won't fall if the girls start going to school. Women working, some of the women don't have male members in their house. Now, if they don't work, what will they eat? The government doesn't have to provide livelihood to those people or give them some stipends. So these are small steps that the Taliban have to take. And I think the international community will come forward and help the Afghan population. The NGOs, United Nations, have a very important role now to perform within Afghanistan, because the Taliban regime does not have the capacity to undertake.
Absolutely. Brigadier Sahab, absolutely. And I think you are on the money when you say that it is not a very high bar to actually cross when you're talking about allowing girls to go to school. But let me come back to the studio. Dr. Niaz Murza, do we have an idea about how much money does Afghanistan immediately need? I remember Ahmad Rashid Sahab, I interviewed him, he was very close to former President Karzai, and used to say that $100 billion per annum is the price tag that is needed, in dollars, to actually bail out Afghan government each year. Let us say that it might be exaggeration. Even 10 billion is not a small amount, and I don't think at this moment that is forthcoming either. So how, do you have any idea how much might be needed right now?
Well, you have to define the problem. We've been talking about, say, providing humanitarian aid.
Yeah.
What does humanitarian aid? We had this earthquake in Balochistan, and what is humanitarian aid? You give them food, you give them shelter, you give them a tent. Yeah. But this is existing in a situation where there is a working economy as well, right? Yeah. So they'll get a lot of help from that. They'll continue to work. But the situation in Afghanistan is it's not just about the humanitarian aid to the individual families, say about 5% or 10% of the population. There is this fact that the whole overall economy has come to a standstill, right? So what do you mean by humanitarian aid? Just go and give that individual aid to families? That's not going to work. Somehow the economy's wheels have to start turning in.
And otherwise, they have to remonetize the country as well?
Yeah, otherwise you'll have a situation that 100% of the people, almost 100%, will be dependent on handout. And that's going to be an enormous amount.
Yesterday we heard that the West is going to, the UN is actually going to fly in cash, that is dollars, to Afghanistan to help people to remonetize. But Afghan currency, kindly help me understand, because you have an economic lens also. The economy is not performing. How is it that Afghani, the currency, is only depreciated 20%? Remember 2 crises that we went through. When USSR ended, ruble totally fell, its value disappeared. And similarly, when Iraq took over or occupied Kuwait, Kuwait's currency also disappeared. I mean, was not even worth peanuts. But here, Afghanistan's entire system is liquidated. and yet the currency is only 20% depreciated.
Well, because there's not really a fully functional exchange market as well. Everything has come to a standstill. So you don't really have a good idea at this moment what is the going rate. If you have a functioning economy with the foreign exchange market also functioning, then you might have an idea. But nobody really knows.
The currency is limited to Afghanistan, nowhere.
Afghanistan, yeah. So we don't know. But then this is the question. If you want to get the economy running, to some extent you will have to involve the Afghan Taliban.
Right.
You can't have a situation where the central authority has no role to play and the economy just moves on its own.
Right.
So some choices will have to be made. It's not just about humanitarian aid, it's about having some measure of a functioning economy, and that would involve some money flowing to the Afghan Taliban,
right.
and them having a role.
That's a very interesting point, but here's the thing. I usually don't go for invoking this quasi-rule in this program, but today I'm going to do it. Murphy's Law. That which can go wrong will go wrong.
Yeah.
And in South Asia, it seems to be a law, something natural like law of gravity. Do you think that the hardliners will give any kind of leeway to the moderates? And whether they are moderates or it is only trick of light?
Well, the dominant faction will remain the hard liners. There's no situation where they'll just disappear and leave the moderates in place, because what will be the backing of the moderates then? They are not very popular in Afghanistan, at least not in the cities, and they will only survive because there is the armed faction which is there to make sure that their writ applies. So ultimately it's the hard faction that is going to take all the decisions, and the moderates will literally have to convince them, beg them, and then it's up to the hardcore to decide the calculations. Okay, the country is going to completely go belly up and we have to make some sort of opening to the moderate ideas, but it's not going to be a very easy situation. There will be this continuous tussle, because the hard faction doesn't really understand how the global economy works, how even a national economy works.
Doesn't care actually.
Yeah, they just know how to fight.
Right, and that is a very important point. Professor Lucas, you focus on international relations as well. It seems that in Washington, in Beijing, in Moscow, people keep on talking about great power rivalry. And the problem at this moment is Afghanistan is a test case where the world should have actually worked together. Do you think that in coming days, these political contradictions of global order are not going to negatively affect Afghanistan, sir?
Well, I think there's a space right now because almost everybody in the international order is standing back at the highest level. Nobody really wants to engage with Afghanistan as a functioning country because it's not functioning. That space paradoxically means that you can see this element of aid going into Afghanistan at local levels, where you have local economies functioning. And remember, that's not just a question of aid, but of course, a lot of the Afghan local economies have been dependent on remittances coming back from Afghans who work in Iran, who work in Pakistan. Now, that may continue as well. But the big, broad question you're asking is can the Taliban reconnect Afghanistan to the international economy? And I don't think that question turns as much upon great power competition as much as on two alternatives. And one alternative is that you get Afghanistan reconnecting to the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, to, let's say, the Western economic system. That's not going to happen without the Taliban really, I think, engaging with the West in a much more constructive way. The second alternative is the interesting one, because it does include Pakistan, it includes China, which is the alternative economic system coming out of Beijing across Asia. But I don't think China is going to reach out to the Taliban to connect Afghanistan up to the Chinese alternative until they see stability within the country. And as the Brigadier mentioned, right now, China and Russia, their number one concern might not be the economy in Afghanistan. It might be the idea that, quote, terrorism doesn't spill over from Afghanistan back into their countries.
Right. About terrorism also, it is very important to remember that during the Doha talks, there were commitments made that ETIM IMU, TTP, and other groups like that will not be allowed space in Afghanistan. While we haven't heard that they have been expelled or handed over to the concerned countries, we see that the specter of ISKP also keeps on rearing its head. So in coming days, do you think that this issue of terrorism is going to go away and all these countries are going to feel comfortable enough to engage with Afghanistan?
I think the label of terrorism won't go away, because the label of terrorism is very convenient. It's convenient politically for the U.S. to say it's still involved in Afghanistan after withdrawing, because it will have over-the-horizon operations. It's convenient for Russia and China to say they'll be involved in Afghanistan to deal with terrorism. But I think that terrorism label is a distraction. Look, the number one issue for Afghans on the ground is not terrorism. Sure, IS horizon can cause trouble on the ground, but the biggest threat right now is economic, political, and social. And terrorism is more of a label for people to divert from those fundamental issues rather than the central concern that we're going to be dealing with this autumn and this winter.
Right. Brigadier Saab, if you remember, when the Doha Agreement actually was signed, at that moment we were told that there were secret or classified clauses in that. Since then, we have heard that perhaps that agreement doesn't hold anymore, but we haven't seen the US government actually declassifying those agreements, despite the fact that there is a new administration. It has nothing to lose in declassifying that. Is there a possibility that the agreement, Doha agreement, still holds, and that's why both sides are respecting it or trying to?
I have no idea about the secret clauses of the Doha agreement. So any comment, just be a suggestion as to what those secret clauses could be. But the Doha agreement must stay. But say it must stay there because that's the only the paper that the Taliban have signed in which they have at least agreed that there will be no terrorism outside. The world will not be threatened by terrorists based in Afghanistan. Now that is, one thing of saying that Afghan soil will not be used for terrorist activities. But what's more important is that these groups, the ATM or the IMU or the TTP, they have been fighting alongside the Taliban.